To begin with, I'm going to quickly give a biography of Leila Khaled, although to most people she won't need an introduction. Leila Khaled is a member of the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and as well as the Palestinian National Council. She is a symbol of Palestinian resistance movement for reasons that are historically, politically obvious to everyone. She was born in Haifa, but fled with her family as a refugee to Lebanon in 1948 and has written an autobiography titled My People Shall Live. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I used it extensively in my own work, and I know that even people who are not working necessarily on the Palestinian national movement use it as a wonderful document of the time. She is not only a very good guerrilla, she's also a very good writer. There's a documentary film about her that came out in 2005 called Leila Khaled Hijacker. Also recommend that. She currently resides in Amman, and she couldn't be with us in person, courtesy of the UK Border Agency. And as such, we will connect to a video she has taped. It's not a live connection, which we will have on now. So if one of our lovely organizers could help with that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank Palestine Society at South for inviting me to participate in this conference. Unfortunately, I couldn't come to meet you in person because my visa application was denied by the British authorities. I want to address the issue of the left's social mobilization in the refugee camps in exile, and I will divide this topic in two stages. First, between 1967 and 1982, and second, after 1982 and until today. The formation of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine at the end of 1967 marked the beginning of Palestinian left engaged in the armed resistance, even though a Palestinian Communist Party already existed. The other Palestinian left organization, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, emerged from the ranks of the Popular Front in 1969. Mass mobilization in the camps centered on recruiting to the resistance movement, especially the armed struggle. In this mobilization, the main issue raised by the Palestinian left was defining the enemy camp, the camp of friends, the forces of the revolution, and the goals of the revolution, and the means for reaching these goals. The first document issued by the Popular Front in 1969, the political and organizational strategy for the liberation of Palestine, concentrated on these issues. As for the enemy camp, it was considered crucial to define the enemy camp in order to make the people aware that theirs was a long-term struggle against imperialism, especially US imperialism. Second, Zionism as a racist reactionary movement, Israel, the state that occupied the land of the Palestinians, Palestine, and the Arab reaction. And to avoid making people fear that this is a big camp to face, it was defined the friends of the revolution. This was important to show people that we were not alone in our struggle, but could gain support from the Arab and international liberation movements, the socialist camp, and the democratic and progressive forces on the Arab and international level. The forces of the revolution were defined as the workers, peasants, the poor classes, and the petit bourgeois. This class analysis defining which classes had interests in the revolution distinguished the left from mainstream of the resistance movement. Accordingly, the struggle for leadership of the revolution was a class struggle because the bourgeois not carry the revolution to its ultimate goals. What are the goals of the revolution? The liberation of Palestine and the establishment of a democratic state. Later, the left agreed to establishing an independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital as a step towards establishing a democratic state in historical Palestine. And last, implementing the Palestinian people's right for return. What were the means in this analysis? It was the means of the revolution was the People's Liberation War, using armed struggle. Accordingly, all programs for mobilizing the masses on these issues intended to serve the armed struggle itself. The mechanisms for mobilization. We can list them as 1, 2, 3, but I want to mention them as how we mobilize the people with these mechanisms. First, it was the direct contact with the masses in the camps, at home and workplaces, in order to explain the thoughts of the left for implementing its program. Seminars and workshops to discuss the current political situation as well as social issues. Third, working through the PLO's mass unions and syndicates. Fourth, services provided by the left organizations to support the camp population in health, education, and training, such as clinics, kindergartens, and vocational training centers. Fifth, information activities such as magazines, bulletins, etc., to explain political positions. Political education also was one of the mechanisms, sending cadre to theoretical courses provided by the socialist countries to study Marxism, philosophy, international law, and other fields. This helped to educate the members in Marxist thinking in order that they might spread this thinking among the masses. To further this goal and make it accessible to more people, the Popular Front established a cadre school, first in 1969 in Jordan and later in Lebanon. Also, university education was one of the mechanisms to mobilize people. Due to the opportunities provided by the socialist countries, the left was able to send thousands of young people from the refugee camps to study on scholarships, who otherwise would have been unable to attain a university education. And the establishment of folklore groups in order to preserve our popular culture, because Israel also declared that the Palestinian culture is its culture. The establishment of mass organizations for women and youth linked to the Popular Front in major Palestinian population centers inside and outside of Palestine. Through these mechanisms, the left meant to mobilize and organize different sectors of Palestinian society, especially workers, youth, and women. The left had special programs geared to organizing and mobilizing each of these sectors. Because the right of return is the main goal of the Palestinian struggle, it was always present in the discourse of the resistance movement, including the left, of course, and was consistently linked to the armed struggle. This intended to keep alive the masses' dream of return and transform it into a permanent element of their culture. In spite of the division among the left organizations, yet their political vision was clear enough to be differentiated from the right wing of the resistance movement. Post-1982, when the resistance movement was dispersed in the wake of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the Palestinian national movement declined to the point that the armed struggle virtually ceased outside of occupied Palestine. The whole movement have received a heavy blow. This did not mean that the mobilization of the masses in the camps stopped. But time was needed to restore the people's confidence in the resistance, especially after the massacres of Sabra and Shatila. By 1987, the outbreak of the Intifada in Palestine gave people new hope. The role of the masses in the camps outside of Palestine was redefined as one of supporting the Intifada. In this context, the left was able to revitalize its position among the masses and became more active. The same mechanisms were used as before 1982, but adapted according to suit the new supportive role of the masses in the camps outside Palestine, because the focus of the struggle had moved from outside to inside the occupied territories. After 1982, many of the Arab countries cut off funds to the Palestinian resistance movement. In some cases, they besieged the movement, restricting its freedom of movement, which affected its level of activity. This imposed a great burden on the overall movement, but especially on the left. Added to this was the collapse of the Soviet Union and other socialist countries, which further restricted the influence of the left. This meant the end of scholarships, courses, medical treatment opportunities, and the supply of arms. Also, after 1982, NGOs began to emerge. In a situation where the resistance freedom of movement was restricted, they tried to be an alternative, and some succeeded in attracting cadre from the resistance movement, including the left. This became very prominent in the occupied territories after the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were concluded secretly by the right-wing PLO leadership, behind the back of the people and all organizations. This created a split among the masses and the organizations, and the left faced a difficult situation explaining its opposition to these accords because of their failure to address the liberation of the land and the right of return, that is, the original goals of the resistance. At the same time, the Islamist current grew and gained strength due to its resistance of the occupation and opposition to the Oslo Accords. This had a great effect on the masses as religious thinking, in some cases, replaced progressive nationalist ideas. With the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority, the resistance inside Palestine continued, including armed struggle. That was clear in the Second Intifada in 2001. Despite many attempts, the left was unable to unite in this new situation due to differences in their political positions, which weakened its position among the masses. Nonetheless, the left did not give up, and the issue of the unity of the left forces is still an important issue which the Popular Front insists on pursuing. We say this openly by addressing the masses. National unity remains to be among the main goals of the left, especially after the conflict between Fatah and Hamas. The left took many initiatives to pressure both sides towards unity, and these continue. In spite of all the difficulties and obstacles facing the left, we are determined to continue our struggle by all means, including armed struggle, to achieve our goals, because this conflict is a long historical one. It's a struggle for existence and not borders. Thank you.
The second presenter on our panel today is Jameel Hilal, who's a Palestinian sociologist who's published a number of books, published and edited, written, authored and edited, a number of books and numerous articles on Palestinian society and history. Professor Hilal has worked as an associate senior research fellow at Muwatin in Ramallah, and he's been a senior research fellow at the Law Institute, the Development Studies Center, and at the Institute of Women's Studies at Birzeit University. His recent publications are on poverty, Palestinian political parties, the Palestinian middle class, and the Palestinian political system after Oslo. He is the editor of Where Now for Palestine, The Demise of the Two-State Solution, which came out in 2007. He's co-authored books on Palestinian customary law and on social capital in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. He's recently worked on polarization in Lebanon, Iraq, and the occupied Palestinian territories. His co-edited book with Ilan Pape, which is called Across the Wall, will be published in April this year. While his most recent book in Arabic is The Palestinian Left, Where To? Professor Hilal is going to be speaking about the shaping of the Palestinian left. Please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think Layla has said in her own terms what I'm going to say. But before I say what I'm going to say, very briefly, I feel I have to respond to something that Azmi said. So maybe one of the present will come and will stand up and defend it. I don't think, and I've just with colleagues done 110 interviews with leaders from the left and cadres from the left and rank and file in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And certainly long interviews and in-depth interviews and more discussions. And none of the interviewees gave the impression that the crisis of the left is a crisis of values. It's not a crisis of values. Certainly there's a problem in the left in Palestine. I think like in other places, faces great challenges, which I hope that in the round table tomorrow, the discussion will come to define these challenges that are facing the Palestinian left. To come to my topic, which is the shaping of the Palestinian left, I want to emphasize two factors, and very briefly, and speak in short term, because of the time and because our group derived 1 hour late, so I'm sure you would want us to finish soon, but I'd like to give you the chance to respond to what we are saying. I think the first important factor that was decisive in forming the left, and I'm speaking about the left after the Nakba, that is, after the establishment of the Israeli state, is the re-emergence of Palestinian nationalism in the 60s. And the adoption of the Arab national movement of Marxism. At the time, the Marxism is a more or less open kind of Marxism. It was everything that was available in the market, from Maoism to Guevarism to, and there was really a very intensive discussion of the various literature of Marxism at the time, under the two pressures. The first pressure, the collapse of Arab unity, especially between Egypt and Syria. If you remember, 1961, the Arab unity between the two countries collapsed. And the second factor was the defeat of the pan-Arab states, or the national states like Egypt and Syria in the 67 war. So the Arab nationalist movement, under this duress, if you like, of the failure of the pan-Arabist dream turned to the left and began to adopt Marxist terminology, ideas, following the successes of national liberation movements who adopted Marxist ideas, saying Cuba, Vietnam, and so forth. So this is a crucial period in the formation of the Palestinian left. At the same time as the 1967 war, if you remember, immediately after, the PLO was taken over by the resistance movement. That was in 1968, and that, I think, that is the most decisive factor in forming the Palestinian left, because the Palestinian left, from that moment on and until Oslo, became a partner in the process of decision making in the Palestinian national movement. It was represented in all the institutions of the PLO, from the National Council to the Central Council to the Executive Committee. At the same time, it retained its autonomy, political autonomy, organizational autonomy, ideological autonomy, and that's, I think, this because what happens, sometimes people think that the demise of the left came after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after Oslo, etc., etc. But the collapse of the demise of the left, or the weakening, let me say it, be more careful. The weakening of the left was a result of the marginalization of the PLO. Once the PLO was frozen in Oslo, 1993, the left also lost its voice, found itself out of place. It could not, it doesn't know how to function. It was outside the PA, the Palestinian Authority. It was outside of the institution of the Palestinian, of the PLO, because the PLO was no longer frozen, the institutions were frozen, so it had no field to play on. And in fact, I have figures of the popularity of the Palestinian left in 93, just at the time of Oslo, they were gaining something like 17% of the support of the people. A few years later, this 17%, and Hamas was about 10% at the time, about 93, 94. A few years later, it began to reverse. And now it stands about, I'm talking about the left, the four Palestinian organizations which define themselves as left. That is, they, in their programs, they put in the programs socialism as the end aim of their struggle. Now they come about 5%. So there is, in fact, what I'm trying to say is the fact that weakened the PLO with the same factors that weakened the left. So that's one of them. That's the main factor, I think, that was essential in forming the left, because that is the home of the Palestinian left. All the lefts were represented, all the organizations were represented, regardless of size, and also, so the positive aspect of a unified national movement was gained by the left, but also the negative aspects had to accrue to the left. And this is because of what we call the quota system, which was adopted by the left, where each organization is given a quota. And what this meant is that competition or rivalry was transferred to between the left organizations themselves. So there was a lot of, it's frozen the left in factions. I just started. No. The other factor, the other factor was, of course, the PLO institutions were established outside of Palestine. And being established outside Palestine, they found themselves in conflict with the states which hosted the institutions of the PLO. Remember, in Jordan, in 1970-71, there were conflict with the Jordanians. In Lebanon, there was a long civil war. In Syria, there was also conflict with the PLO institutions. So there was this tension all the time between the, including, of course, with the left, between the PLO and the countries, the states in which housed the institutions of the PLO. And so the left had to pay for this, but at the same time, the left had the legitimacy of the PLO, legitimacy of the Palestinian national movement, in fact, as it's, especially in the 70s when the PLO became to be accepted as the sole representative Palestinian, sole representative organization of the Palestinian people inside and outside. The second factor, since I've given 3 minutes to go, was the adoption by the left in the 70s of the Soviet Union as a reference point in terms of organization and in terms of ideology. And in terms of our organization, this took the shape of a sort of adopted what you call it, democratic centralism, which in effect, in practice, as it was practiced in the Soviet Union, is bureaucratic centralism, in which it reflected itself in party organization by lack of internal democracy of the leadership reproducing itself through this organizational principle of democratic centralism. And the other thing is Marxism became adopted as a dogma, and which made the left intellectually lazy. They have all the answers. They send, as Leila mentioned, we sent thousands and thousands of people to study in the Soviet Union and in the socialist countries, part system, Marxism, Leninism, dialectical materialism, and so forth. But very little concrete analysis was done to understand what is happening to Palestinian society, what's happening in the Arab world, and even less what's happening internationally. Because the literature of the Soviet Union was just taken on and repeated. And that's, I think, why the left now, part of the reason why the left now, when it was out of the PLO, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, found itself like an orphan, left in the cold. But we can discuss this a bit in more detail, I think, tomorrow or this afternoon. So once the PLO was marginalized, when the Soviet collapsed, the left was left out in the cold. How much left?
Just a couple of minutes, please.
Okay. So the last factor that I would, if to make sort of the analysis a bit more complete, is any consideration of why, what shapes the left. One has to look at the complexity of the Palestinian situation. And one of the complexities, which I think Leila referred to, but referred to as a non-problem, but in fact it's a serious problem, is the truncated political class structure of Palestinian society. Classes in Palestinian society were not formed in relation to each other. The working class, if you take the West Bank and Gaza Strip, working class mostly was formed by employment in the Israeli markets, by working for the Israeli capitalists. The middle class was formed in the Gulf states, working for the Gulf bourgeoisie, or in Jordan, or outside. So that is, each class was developing separately, not in relation to each other. And this is made extremely difficult. Problems of mobilization, problems of creating linkages between the classes and providing a unified vision and unified strategy. The other thing, of course, the dispersion of Palestinian society. Palestinian society that in the 48th, in West Bank and Gaza Strip, in diaspora or Shatat. And each of these communities face different problems, tasks, conditions, etc., and need a special kind of strategy within a strategy that links the struggle as a whole. And that is something I think that the left has to maybe think about if it wants to, provide something different from either Hamas or Fatah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I do apologize for being so authoritarian and cutting it off, but...
It's accepted from you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Our last presenter, of course not least, is again a familiar face to many of you, Professor Gilbert Achcar, my colleague here in the Development Studies Department, left Lebanon for Europe in 1983, and he has taught and researched in Paris and Berlin before moving in 2007 to join us here at SOAS. His latest works include The Clash of Barbarisms, The Making of the New World Order in 2006, The 33-Day War, Israel's War on Hezbollah in Lebanon in 2007, which was co-authored with Michel Warshawski, and Perilous Power, The Middle East and U.S. Foreign Policy in 2007, co-authored with Noam Chomsky. His next book, which I eagerly await, since I can't read French really all that well, is The Arabs and the Holocaust, The Arab-Israeli War of Narratives, which will be translated, which its English translation will be coming out in April. Professor Achcar is going to speak, I'm sure in his usual incisive and provocative way, about the strategic deficiencies of the PLO left. Please.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you. Well, first of all, I should say that in the very limited time that we have each, it is absolutely impossible to really cover the topic that I'm assigned, which is discussing the strategic deficiency of the PLO left. So I'll just focus on a few points selectively. The second preliminary remark is this is, in my case at least, I would say not things that I'm saying in hindsight, but an ongoing debate that I have had personally with the Palestinian left, comradely, for 40 years now. Started very precociously. Don't think that I'm that old. And a third point is that I will focus on the main, and by far the main component of the PLO left, which is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, in the leadership of which Layla Khalid, is a member. And my criticism will be from a Marxist perspective, which happens to be mine, and which happens to be the one that is proclaimed as the official, let's say, ideological reference of the Popular Front. So it's legitimate to discuss the Popular Front or the PLO left from that angle. Now, what I will discuss are three issues, and I limit myself to these three issues, which are far from being exhaustive. The first one is the regional dimension of the Palestinian struggle from a left-wing perspective. I leave aside the international dimension, but focus on the regional, the Arab, the pan-Arab dimension. And from that angle, the Palestinian resistance movement, as it emerged after '67, but it was founded, especially in the case of Fatah, before that, as we know, was characterized by a kind of reaction to Arab nationalism through what I would call a Palestino-centrist perspective. Fatah embodied very well this Palestino-centrist perspective, believing, the centrality, not only the centrality of Palestinian cause, but the centrality of the Palestinian struggle itself and its movement, and therefore this centrality would allow the movement to deal with the rest of Arab countries as if the movement itself was one country dealing with, getting into diplomatic relations. Hence the key principle upon which Fatah was based, which is the non-interference in Arab countries' internal affairs, which is, of course, completely contradictory with any pan-Arab national or revolutionary perspective. Now, this Palestino-centrism, or this kind of, this vision of the centrality of the struggle, I would say is probably less valid in the Palestinian case than in any other case because of the nature of the Palestinian struggle as one of an uprooted people expelled from its homeland and forced to be dispersed among neighboring countries in a balance of forces with the Zionist state, which is, from the, let's say, if we just oppose the Palestinian people alone to the Zionist state, the balance of forces is overwhelmingly, of course, in favor of the Israeli state. So this kind of perspective, which upon which Fatah was based, was actually, despite proclamations to the contrary, one which also informed the actual practice of the Palestinian left. The Palestinian left, Popular Front mainly, is, as has been said, originating in the Arab nationalist movement. It is a kind of radicalization within the movement. The movement itself radicalized. The Popular Front represented the bulk of the movement, the leading force in the movement, the Palestinian section, and adopted Marxism-Leninism. And in this adoption, a necessity to break with its own Arab nationalist past. And even also ended up considering that its transformation from petit bourgeois to proletarian, to borrow George Habash's phrase, was mostly identified with building relations with the Soviet Union, with Moscow. So it is this kind of narrow perspective that informed the whole thing. And the Palestino-centrism, the actual Palestino-centrism can be summed up in a formula by George Habash when he said that the Arab movement is at the service of the front, the Popular Front, and not the front at the service of the movement. So, this inversion of perspective is a characteristic here. But what does it, what kind of consequences does it bear? A key one is this possibility for the Palestinian movement to put its own interest as a movement, including its organizational forms, as a priority. And this is linked to the development of offices, of a bureaucracy, which of course characterized the whole resistance movement after 1967, but that included the Palestinian left, which means also the need of money. And here I will refer to what Azmi was saying precisely about their need as movements for money. But they had special needs for money because of the kind of existence that they developed, all these offices, the bureaus and all that, and this kind of open existence within the neighboring Arab states. And this was related, closely related, and here is the most acute contradiction with any, let's say, pan-Arab revolutionary perspective, that was connected with relations built with dictatorial Arab regimes, whether Iraq, Libya, or Syria, with ups and downs in the case of the Popular Front. Now, any attempt at excusing that by saying, well, they have to, exist as movements, they have needs and all that, so they have to build relations with the states, is a matter of choice between if you have really a revolutionary perspective or if your main target and goal is to exist in the form in which you exist. I would say that the period under which the Popular Front in Syria was underground is a period within which it grew much faster than whatever happened after that. The relation with the Syrian regime in particular, who had Palestinian blood on its hands, has been very damaging for the reputation of the whole Palestinian left, including the left wing that existed at that time within Fatah itself. Second point is what I would call the PLO predicament. Well, you know that PLO has been founded in 1964 under tutelage of the Arab states, the League of Arab States. It was founded in Amman, and the opening speech was by King Hussein. When the PLO was seized by the guerrilla organization after '67, it was mostly given actually by the Arab regimes to Fatah. Fatah, which had close connection to all the Arab regimes and was mostly funded by the richest of the Arab regime, which happens to be the closest ally of the United States in the region, the Saudi Kingdom. And of course, this is another contradiction, but I'm dealing here with the left, not with Fatah. And at the beginning, the Palestinian left, when Fatah convened the National Council, the Palestinian National Council, the Popular Front criticized very radically this perspective and organized popular meeting in the camps and saying all these are real national councils, Palestinian national councils. The Democratic Front had the slogan of, popular councils everywhere. So there was a critique of the institutional and social class nature of the PLO. This critique, which did not prevent and should not prevent using the PLO tactically as a platform, while, as the Popular Front did for some years, boycotting its executive committee, because the whole PLO structure is not democratic, but designed from top to bottom, and therefore permanently under control of Fatah. This is something that cannot be changed. This kind of perspective, the critical perspective, was abandoned by the Palestinian left. And the whole history of the 80s and after that is one of permanent reconciliations with the Arafat leadership of Fatah after every single turn in the name of national unity, whether after Arafat went from Lebanon to Egypt, breaking the Arab boycott of Egypt in '83, or after, you had the reconciliation in '87, and in '88, the Palestinian left, Popular Front, finally accepted with some protest the outcome of the Palestinian National Council in that year, which was a recognition not only of Resolution 181 of the partition of Palestine, but even of Resolution 242. And that was, I mean, the price the PLO leadership paid for, you know, getting into negotiations with the United States, and as a precondition, actually, to get into negotiations with Israel itself. And, well, this lack of critical attitude and this inability to push or to present themselves as an alternative to the PLO is something that also weakened very much the Palestinian left when you compare it to Hamas. The strength of Hamas has been precisely that it was able to appear as the real alternative to this whole setup, to the whole structure of the PLO. Azmi said, and he's right on that, there's the shift in the second half of '88, the first major year of the first Intifada. And this is the period when the left starts losing ground, although in the first period of an Intifada, it plays a major role in the Intifada, in the leadership of an Intifada, and Hamas starts gaining ground. But why so? Well, at that time, the Popular Front accepted what the PLO leadership, the Arafat leadership, wanted, was that the leadership of the Intifada should move from inside, the unified leadership, to outside, to the PLO, and therefore from then on the communiques of the Intifada were read from Tunis on radio and were designed by the PLO. And we can see this huge difference until now. For instance, in the prisoners' document, the perspective that Hamas puts is, well, we are ready, we are willing to join the PLO, but on the condition that the structure of the PLO is turned into one which is more representative and based on elections, wherever elections are possible among the Palestinians. So this major difference between the left and Hamas is one of the key reasons. I mean, this ability of appearing as an alternative to the PLO leadership is one of the key reasons why Hamas took over, and on a background of weakening left. And finally, and quickly, because I don't have time, I will just mention, of course, what is essential in any left-wing or Marxist perspective is the very weak or absent, one could almost say, social and political dimension of the conception of the struggle that characterized the PLO left. I mean, what we heard about social mobilization, including sending people to the universities in the Soviet Union, I mean, it's not exactly what you would, understand from a Marxist perspective as a social mobilization, social struggle, class struggle. And class struggle meaning not only among the Palestinians, of course, but merging with the class struggle in the countries where Palestinians are present, starting with my own country, Lebanon, where the fate of the Palestinian is absolutely awful. And the issue is that the PLO left, formed in the 60s, was formed around the fetishism of the arms struggle, a conception whereby the liberation of Palestine would be basically, and most of all, based on arms struggle, which is, of course, a very short-term, very illusory perspective. And of course, this kind of perspective is failed historically. But the problem is that the Palestinian left has not been able, well, to overcome this kind of perspective. I, for one, I'm very happy when I see that the Popular Front is able to mobilize tens of thousands of people, over 50,000 in Gaza recently for the anniversary of its foundation. That's great. But when you read the speech of the key leader in Gaza of the Popular Front, where the only perspective is armed struggle and trying to outbid Hamas, armed struggle in Gaza under the present condition, this is offering no real perspective out of the situation for the Palestinian struggle. Of course, other people and other forms of left-wing recomposition are going on, including rethinking about all that. We can point to many good advances in that regard. One important among them is, for instance, the boycott, divestment, sanctions perspective, which is, of course, a much more political and intelligent kind of perspective. It's not enough in itself, but I'm saying this kind of perspective is something which is much more political. I will stop here, but just by saying that, of course, the purpose of my critique, as I've said, this has been an ongoing comradely debate for long, but is precisely that in this very, very tragic moment and this very bad moment for the Palestinian struggle as a whole and for the Palestinian left in particular, it is absolutely necessary to draw upon the lessons of this history critically, draw a balance sheet in order to build a new movement with new perspective. Thank you very much.
I'm going to open the floor to questions in a minute, but I'd like to take the particular privilege granted me as the chair of this session to actually ask a couple of questions, primarily addressed at Professor Achcar, but I'd actually like to hear Professor Hilal on this as well. Gilbert, I actually do recognize that a lot of the critiques that you have are principled, but as somebody who somewhat would consider myself a historian, I was kind of impressed with how Lena and Ilan in the previous session could actually deflect particular things by saying, I'm a historian, and I'm going to use that. I'm a historian, and I want to say in the particular historical junctures which certain events occurred, it was impossible in some senses. And I'd like to hear if you do have an alternative to tell me what would have been possible, a kind of a counterfactual history in some sense. It would have been impossible for PFLP to do anything else. To give you an example, the one instance where they decided not to do non-interference, which is the hijackings of planes that led to the 1970 Black September eventually, subsequent to that event, they had to take into consideration the fact that the Jordanian government did what the Israeli government does, which is to target Palestinian civilians in order to teach a lesson to Palestinian organizations. And in some ways, PFLP representing Palestinians could not have taken into consideration the fact that their actions would have resulted, as it did in subsequent years in Lebanon, their actions would have resulted in Palestinian refugees, unarmed civilians, being targeted by Arab regimes. In some sense, their position of compromise comes from that. And this is the first question. The second thing is, you mentioned the fetishization of armed struggle. And you mentioned this in a sense by saying, well, there were other possibilities. But having gone through all of the issues of Al-Hadaf and Hurriya as part of my original research, there was no reason for them not to think that armed struggle wouldn't be achieved, given Mao's success in China, given Giap and, Ho Chi Minh's success first against the French and then later against the Americans, and given guerrilla armed struggle sort of leading to establishment of a communist state in Cuba. I mean, they weren't pulling ideas out of the air. There were these three very important instances where doctrines, theories were developed. And so for them to think about armed struggle as a possibility, as a possible means of achieving their goals was not necessarily completely idealistic. They had historical precedents that they could have drawn on. And I'd really like to hear what you think about those things, and perhaps Professor Hilal as well.
No?
Yes, please.
I'm certainly not referring, when I speak of the necessity of an alternative kind of perspective, to hijacking planes. I mean, if this is what you understood, then I expressed myself very badly. It's not, certainly not that. When I speak of the fetishism of armed struggle, I mean, of course, the hijacking of planes is the peak of this kind of perspective. And the Popular Front itself, fortunately, had to cut and to stop this kind of disastrous perspective. which was considered as a kind of propaganda by the fact.
Yes.
We have to be, to go into spectacular actions. But, I mean, the end result was quite bad, including giving a pretext to the Jordanian regime to unleash its bloody suppression of the Palestinian struggle. So yes, no, another Palestinian struggle was possible, I would say, like the World Social Forum. I think it was possible, but that would have meant, of course, a very different perspective of understanding, and here it's related to your second question. Well, Mao, Vietnam, but, I mean, precisely the point is, fetishism is when you just, imitate such models without looking into the specificities of your own situation. The Palestinians are not in China fighting a foreign invader with an overwhelming majority. They are not in Vietnam. They are Palestinians. They are uprooted from their people, from their country, pushed out and fighting a state which is one of the mightiest military powers in the region, if not more, if not on earth, actually, if you think of its nuclear power, but that's something else. In that case, two things have to be very clear. One, that because the Palestinians are spread among Arab states, they depend ultimately on the Arab Revolution, if you want to take this concept. And as Habash put it at one point, we need an Arab Hanoi. That is, we need revolutionary powers to support us, but not the Syrian regime, not dictatorship, not Saddam Hussein. That's a big point. So the perspective would have been one which would have been completely different, one where class struggle and national struggle would have been related, where armed struggle would have been used as a political dimension, or let's say used as one dimension of the struggle for its political purpose, and not believed to be the way through which Palestine would be liberated. In that regard, if you make a comparison between the ANC, although their situation is much better than Palestinian in terms of balance of forces between the black and the white minority in South Africa. But look at how the ANC was at the same time organizing class struggle, trade union, huge COSATU class struggle, and at the same time national struggle, and using the armed struggle, but not believing that that would be the recipe for it all. Thank you.
No, I think it's a central issue, and it was very much discussed within the resistance movement, within the NAS movement, and within the PLO, where armed struggle, and I think the problem was really not armed struggle, because in places like Lebanon, where you've come from, arming the camps had a very important mobilizing function, because the camps in Lebanon, as my colleague here knows, were trampled on by the Lebanese state. They were oppressed, not allowed to go out without permission, worse than the Israeli occupation. So when the PLO armed the camps, they became a liberating force, and they felt their dignity as human beings. Although, of course, the armed struggle there was not used against the Israelis, because, in fact, it was used for self-protection, for self-dignity, for feeling that they are now fighters. They are militant fighters and not being trampled on by the Deuxième Bureau of the Lebanese state. Now, I think the problem is often that is made when analyzing Palestinian situation is that we try to compare it to other kind of situation, but it isn't, because you have Palestinians are composed of three major components, which are extremely different situations. There are the Palestinians of 48. Telling them to use armed struggle is telling the Israelis to transfer them immediately or whatever. In Lebanon, of course, the armed struggle led eventually to a civil war in Lebanon, in Jordan, and to Palestinians being evicted out, the BLO being evicted out, and resistance being subdued. In Lebanon, it was, in fact, as if you remember, the civil war started by the phalangists through the Bas in Ain Rumana, which they attacked Palestinians, they provoked the Palestinians, and then, of course, much of the militarization, and I agree, there was over-militarization of the PLO, including the left, in Lebanon, in response to a situation, and they let themselves, I think this is where maybe the question of what could have been done the situation was not overdetermined, could have been, is that we could have, or the PLO, or the left at least, could have prevented the PLO being involved in a civil war where things got out of hand, and eventually, of course, we were dragged into more militarization, more bureaucratization, and the situation were drawn away from the issue with national liberation and against Israel. Now, in the situation in Gaza and the West Bank, armed struggle is one of the things that Hamas is using, and I think it's been using armed struggle or resistance as an ideology, not as a practice, and as an elitist form of organization. That is, few people, you people, stay, rest, and we do the struggle for you. What we need is you to clap for us. And so that's not, armed struggle should be an enabling, empowering form. And this was what happened in the first Intifada and the first part of the Intifada, where everybody in the society was involved in one form or another of fighting against the occupation. And it was the most successful at the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, and then we'll proceed on that basis. The lady in the back, gentleman up front, and then Dina, and I'll get you in the next row.
My question has to do with what you said, which I agree with you about the social and the last point you made about the thinness, if you will, of the social and political. And I think that is something that the left and Fatah were involved in the sense that if you look at the documents, particularly around the woman question, which, by the way, everybody, is part of the left historically. If we're talking about socialism in the Soviet Union, because one of the things the leadership of all the political parties in the PLO did was that it recommended to the cadres to, quote unquote, respect the traditions of the people. And this was code, I think, for not knowing how to have, say, a more dialectical or transformative view of a society in the process of a national liberation struggle or resistance struggle in almost a Fanonian sense, because there was a kind of break, not necessarily by the society, but by the leadership around this category of respecting the people's tradition. And that was coded language for things around, I think, around women, around sexuality. So I'm wondering if you might speak to, perhaps from another perspective or however you'd like to, the general question of the woman question in relationship to the sort of criticisms you're raising, as well as the possible alternatives.
Yes, please.
I wonder if anybody could relate to a specific proposal and event in 1971 when an Israeli who had become an anti-Zionist tried to get the Palestinian left to take up as an alternative to armed struggle, to imitate the Zionist movement in 1946-47 when they landed ships on the beach to force the British to accept immigrants as a form of advertising and to put the Zionist state off balance. As far as I know, it was always dismissed as demeaning because it was not fitting with the armed struggle. May I say also that in my involvement in a radio program in Australia when about the Palestinian program there, mainly PFLP, and every week it was about the armed struggle, right? And they never wanted to hear about anything else. And I must say, when I produced an anti-Zionist, mainly of Jewish people, in a program, it was just ignored. And that went on for 6 years. So I don't think that exposure to our alternative made any difference.
Dina?
I want to go back, Gilbert, to your notion of Palestinocentrism and to try and ask you the question. Would the alternative have been to ally themselves to the Arab left? And what was happening to the Arab left at that time? Because I think that is central to your argument, but perhaps you did not perhaps make it clearly, but that's my comment.
Okay, if you could answer these three questions, and then we'll take another three.
Which was
Would you like to begin, Jameel?
No, which question? Decentralism is your...
Okay. First, let me say that, it has been mentioned, we'll take of concrete models. The first Intifada, indeed, is the best moment, and by far, in the Palestinian struggle. 88 is the peak of the Palestinian struggle. At the same time, it's a struggle where no weapons were used, but stones. It shows what? It shows just the intelligence of the fact that you don't use the kind of tool in which your enemy is far superior to you. It's not in the interest of the Palestinian people under occupation to use weapons against the occupation. It was much stronger during the first Intifada than during the second. And the contrast between the first Intifada and the second is very clear. What I'm saying here has been said by a lot of Palestinian people, intellectuals and all that, criticizing the militarization of the second Intifada. The first Intifada, the issue is not only that it was not, it was using more clever kind of forms of struggle, but as Jameel said, it was based on a social mobilization, and here you had the real social mobilization through committees in the villages, in the neighborhoods, and all that, in the cities, mobilizing the community, women, men, everybody. And this was really, the first Intifada actually became a kind of model for the whole Arab left as a form of revolutionary struggle that is possible in the region. The second example I will give of a merge between Palestinian left and Arab left, I would take the case of Syria, where in the 70s grew up from the Palestinian left and in connection with the Syrian left, a radical left movement, which was composed of what became later the Communist Action Party of Syria, and in the camps, I don't remember the exact name, I think it was the Lijan Shabia, the popular committees in the camp, and there were several hundred militants organized in the camps in that. And here you have an example, because they were one single organization working together, of a merge between Palestinians in their country and the rest of the revolutionary struggle in the same country against the state, the bourgeois state, the dictatorship that exists there. So I'm speaking of concrete possibilities. It's not a matter of, kind of easy critique. It's not that. I mean, I was part of the Lebanese left, and I would wished that the Palestinian left, instead of just, communicating from outside, believes that it is its own task to merge, really, with a left-wing movement that they could have helped to create, actually. They related to some small factions in the case of Popular Front, the so-called Socialist Action Party, but this remained a very, very marginal experience. So the issue here is, I mean, when I discuss Palestinocentrism, I mean that the conception whereby the Palestinian struggle is something disconnected from the rest and has to relate with the rest is a kind of diplomatic, or you support us or you clap for us or something like that. The Palestinian struggle has to be seen as a component, an integral component of the social struggle in the countries where it is. And the other dimension related to the issue of when you consider the concrete balance of forces involved is the fact that given the nature of the Israeli state, it is not possible to overthrow, let's say, Zionism from outside. Any belief in the possibility of destroying Zionism or liberating Palestine from outside is a total illusion. It's a matter of balance of forces, precisely because this is not South Africa, precisely because this is a state built on the expulsion and ready to go through a new transfer if necessary. And we can see with the shift to the far right of the Israeli society that this is becoming actually a very possible perspective. So we have to understand that it is essential also strategically for the Palestinian struggle to be able to break the Israeli society, the consensus, to break the Zionist consensus in the Israeli society and win over, through clever politics, a major segment of the Israeli society itself. This is essential in terms of strategy when we look at the struggle. The final point I would say, I won't comment on the issue of women because I've read already the paper by Atimad Muhanna. The next session, she deals with this issue much better than whatever I could do. So this will be in the next session.
Yes, Mr. True, I think that the left has been, and they are aware of it, and from my discussions from now, they are aware of it, they are aware that they have been giving too much or one-sided emphasis to the national struggle and little emphasis to the social struggle, to the social issues, and a lot of social issues. And if you look at the programs of the left, for all the left parties, the social programs are not different. There are copies, exactly, in question of women, in question of workers, in question of youth, in question of social security, whatever, poverty, employment, they are similar. But they haven't, it's on paper. And it remained of secondary importance. Most of the differences between the left are differences on political issues and not on social issues. In social issues, they are, as I said, they are identical, but in practice, there hasn't been any major campaigns, major fights that enabled the left to gain experience from waging social struggles for the rights of women, for the rights of workers, for neighborhood, for against high prices, whatever, against corruption, for example, the PA, etc. Because all the emphasis has been on the national issue. So that side, and now I think there is an awareness that if you want to build a social constituency, which different or against what Hamas is doing and Fatah is doing, you have to engage in social issues. You have to get in social struggle, to mobilize people on social issues that touch on their interest. And this, unfortunately, hasn't happened so far. There are now sort of, I know that sort of the left women organizations are making coalitions now, so to provide a joint program of action. Workers in the West Bank and Gaza Strip also are, that of the left organization are joining to put a joint vision and start it. But this is just starting now and in the beginning. The other issues, I don't know how to approach this issue of Palestinian centralism. In fact, there is, as I said in my previous talk, that a reaction against the failure of Pan-Arabist movement was the sort of over-Palestinization of the perspective, because the Arab pan-nationalists views that the way to liberate Palestine is through Arab unity. Fatah came and reversed it. The way to Arab unity is to liberate Palestine by the Palestinian, solely by Palestinian action. The problem, of course, would have been easier for the Palestinian left if there was a strong Arab left. But the situation of the Arab left is much worse even than the situation of the Palestinian left. And the European left even worse than both.
I'm going to take 4 questions, and I'm going to ask you to really limit your question. Please don't make a statement. If you want to actually talk to them, please talk to them afterwards, because I do want to get the time in to discuss. Abed first, this lady over here. We had 2 people back in the back row, the lady and a gentleman 2 seats over who had already had their hands up.
There's 3 issues I think that have to be focused on. One is the question of absolute negativity towards the past of the movement. And this is a very serious issue, I think. I think it's a mischaracterization of the movement if we see its history as a history of failure in the 60s and 70s. That was, in fact, the high point of the movement. It wasn't even the first intifada. The situation in the 70s was 10 times better than it became in the 80s. I think the second issue, and connected to that, is a particular view of Fatah as well. Fatah at the time was not Saudi agents, as Professor Achcar had suggested. I mean, if anyone who was seriously studying the history of the movements at the time would know that for the longest time they were an underground movement, combated by most of the regimes, certainly in the period you're describing. Eventually, they opted for a line of having relations with the states around them. That was the logical course to take. In fact, the leftist parties later on regretted their stances against that. Within a regional context, one has to engage with the states around them. Otherwise, one is completely delusional. The South Africans did the same, the Vietnamese did the same. One more point quickly. In the case of the Communist Party of South Africa, which is a good parallel to this since we're talking about South Africa, they were engaged within the ANC. This reflected a particular line within liberation struggles of the broad national front. That's the only adequate line in that period. And all the leftist parties understood that, except for some people that still held Professor Achcar's line at the time. And their own line was proven to have failed in Jordan in 1970 when the DFLP tried to provoke a regime, and that failed. No, the only reason why I take a bit of time is that it is important. It is important to highlight a particular Palestinian perspective that is absent here. I'm sorry if the audience feels hostile to this, but I'm just expressing this particular perspective.
Okay. I'm going to raise a question from the title of your talk, Professor Achcar, was about strategic deficiencies. I'll come back to the first point you highlighted about the fact of the Popular Front finding allies in the neighboring Arab countries. If you bring to this a non-Marxist strategic analysis, you could think in the clear asymmetric, power asymmetrical situation that they were confronted to, they needed to find powerful allies. Now, we can argue that these turned out not to be powerful allies, but at the time they were perceived as powerful allies. So I was wondering, at the time, which other allies could have been effective if we look at perhaps from a non-Marxist perspective? And I think the answer you provided in your talk was in the third deficiency that you highlighted, which is the weak social and political mobilization. And you came back to that, saying that you believed more in revolution, in fact, mobilization from inside. If we go back to the Intifada, that was a completely endogenous movement. There was no a spontaneous uprise. Does that mean, and this is the question that I will put to you, that you don't, in fact, the Popular Front was in exile, was an external movement. It was not really connected to the internal reality in 1988. No. Does that mean that we don't put hopes in the future, and I'm trying to draw lessons for the future, in external leftist movements, and that we should focus mainly on the nationalist scene and on the national left?
Thank you. The lady in the very back row, yes.
Well, I'll start by making just two quick comments, yeah? First of all, to Mr. Hilal, I think you identified the Marxist dogma as a weakness, and I think we are doing injustice in a way, like because Marxism is not dogmatic and shouldn't be dogmatic, and it's actually the people who were leading these movements to blame in the way they interpreted Marxism, because it's just a method, yeah, how you look at the society and how you analyze society, yeah? So this is one. And the other comment is actually to Gilbert. I think like the whole issue of the armed struggle, I mean, the Palestinians or the means of struggle in oppressed nations are determined by the oppressors and not the oppressed. And it's just like, I agree that it shouldn't be like the end, yeah? But it was like an end to, like, it was just a strategy, I think, to achieve, what they wanted to achieve, yeah? So it's not like we shouldn't just say, oh yeah, like armed struggle should be, yeah, like look at it down or like disregarded in this sense, without looking at how vicious, the Israeli occupation is and how militarized and how, like the rest of it, yeah? I would like to ask, I mean, I'm a bit shocked actually by the lack of analysis or the disregard or that you ignore a very important aspect, which is the international and the global aspect, which is imperialism, We all know that in Yemen, when the socialists were in Yemen building a socialist revolution with social and economic, aims, educating women, providing welfare, they were attacked, yeah, and they were undermined, and the jihadists were supported by countries like Britain, like countries like the US, and we cannot disregard this. And this is happening in Palestine in the form of NGOs. And I would like to hear from Mr. Hilal, what do you say about NGOs? What do you say about neoliberalism, And also, what do you say about undermining, these movements which were originally outside and inside? I'm familiar with the Israeli case because I'm from Palestine. The leftist movements were undermined, yeah? I'm researching Fahem, and it's amazing how marginalized and how undermined, these movements were, and when they carried also, as well as the national, the social and the economic.
I'm really sorry, I know what you're saying is really important, but we only have a limited time, so if you could please wrap it up. Thank you.
Finished.
And, yes, the gentleman right there.
Yeah, I really, with all respect to the speakers, I mean, we've covered theory, right? And we all know now we've got a problem, and different perspectives ruled or made their marks on the Palestinian struggle. But where do we go now? If we believe, or if we are saying, or if what we keep discussing the theory, me as a Palestinian, as a grassroots, as a person, I don't really give a toss, to be honest with you, about the theories now. I want results. Shouldn't we now start thinking in real terms? Because now what the PLO has led us to believe that what the leftist ideas started that will give us a small piece of land and we'll have our own statehood and blah, 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 and then we'll eventually liberate it, has become in itself, instead of means, as an end, and it's become under the cloaks of the Palestinian Authority currently now as the oppressor as well, because we haven't achieved nothing. In this case, I'm not pessimistic, I'm very optimistic, but I think perhaps we should change course now and think about one land, two people, and freedom and democracy for everybody in Palestine,
Okay,
in the whole
you.
of Palestine.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me.
Only the very last question, only because you've got the microphone and you could probably talk over me.
One last question, just building on the gentleman's point, is regardless of the theories and the past and the nostalgia that we were both dreaming about, me being also a Palestinian that is coming inside Palestine, the question now is, where do we go next? And what is the alternative for the current frustration that is taking place in Palestine within the conflict between Fatah and Hamas, with all respect to all parties? The question is where to go next. And most of the Palestinians were thinking that within the current situation, that could have been a fertile ground for the left to re-emerge again. Yet they are not re-emerging. The question is why.
Okay, you have to stop because I've been told that we have to finish this session.
Can we speak?
If you could just take 5 minutes to respond, between both of you. So a couple of minutes each.
And where to go now? I think this is the whole issue, and I understand there is a special session for this to discuss this issue. So and there is a lot of answers. There is a lot of issues to go through there, and so I leave it till there. So, but it's not it wasn't our task in this planet to answer this. Our task was quite different. I think the gentleman there, or the lady says, I think the left did leave or still have left a very positive impact on Palestinian society and Palestinian within the PLO. I don't want to mention all, but the maintaining and solidifying a secular culture, a political culture was one. Emphasizing the values of equality, social justice, the equality of women, organizing workers, organizing students. These are things were started by the left and had a positive impact on Fatah. And there is, I don't think it's in the interest of anybody to deny that culture, that impact of the left. Unfortunately, now the impact on Fatah is not coming from the left, it's coming from Hamas. So, the other question is NGOs. There's the book I wrote on the Palestinian left has a long section on the NGOs and how the NGOs taken over and replaced the democratic associations that were created by the left for women, for workers, for students, for teachers, etc. And it's part of the globalization, part of the they have had, generally speaking, a very negative impact on the Palestinian situation in creating NGOs that provide services and not mobilize people. And that's the main thing. They provide services, but their job is not to organize the people, whether women, workers, etc., and there has been a switch from mobilizing organization to providing services. Whether these services are of value or not, that's a different question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gilbert, if you could just take 1 minute to answer. I know this is incredibly impossible, but I'm getting really very angry looks from the organizers.
Yes.
So I'll try to be very brief. First of all, what has been said about the need for a particular Palestinian perspective here is something that I cannot accept. I've always looked at myself as part of the Palestinian struggle. I don't see things in this ethnic or whatever kind of determinations that you use. I think this is not at all my kind of framework. I'm very sorry for that. And when I discuss the Palestinian left, I discuss it from within, comradely, as I said, and I could tell you that the Popular Front itself is much more tolerant and welcoming for such discussions than many people in this room, it seems, because they published what I'm saying in their internal bulletin in Arabic. That's one point. Second point is about the need for powerful allies and all that, as you said. But the question is, again, either you believe that what is important for you is to be able to, compete with the rest, with offices and all that, and this kind of state without a state that the PLO has become before getting before Oslo. And then, of course, you need funding. And then you need funding. You will try to get it where funds are available, that is from states. But then what are you doing when you are at the Arab level? You are just cutting the branch upon which you could be sitting. That is, you are destroying any possibility for any left-wing development in the region because you are legitimizing dictatorships. Some of the worst dictatorships that could be believed, I mean, whether Iraq or Libya or whatever, or the Syrian regime. And we shouldn't forget that Syrian regime, intervened in '76 to crush and prevent the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese left from winning, which they were on the verge of doing. So this is the key point. And as I said, it would be better for the Palestinian resistance, for Palestinian left, to build itself as a movement, even, underground, in those countries, and overground where possible, like in Lebanon, where, of course, the balance of forces is very different. This is the peculiarity, the weak Lebanese state, than doing, in my view, what they have done at a great major cost, again, in that regard. Of course, vicious occupation and all that, I think here in this assembly, we don't need to say. Whatever the Palestinians do, of course, the first responsibility is that of Israel. Israel is the source of the violence. So the problem is not here. The problem is in the matter of strategic intelligence. To understand that if you have the choice of arms, don't use the arms where your enemy is much, 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 much stronger than you. That's the point. And any use of weapons in that regard, I'm speaking of the occupied territories, is completely suicidal for the Palestinian struggle. It's something else when I'm not against armed struggle in principle. I'm not Gandhist. This is not the point. It's not making a non-violent point. But I'm saying that armed struggle should be seen as one dimension and subordinate to the political struggle and the social struggle, because this is the key perspective. One point. Now, last point, and I will finish. I will finish with this last point. It deals with the whole Arab left and not the Palestinian left alone. Yes. There will be no possibility to build an Arab left if the left is not faithful to the left-wing identity. I mean by that, it's not through outbidding Hamas and Hezbollah on the issue of armed struggle that we will be able to build an Arab left. We'll be able to build an Arab left when the left will be the left on the class struggle, on the women's liberation struggle, on the secular struggle, and here, then you will have a real specificity of the left and ability to build a strong left movement. Thank you.